Hello and welcome to the Debrief. We're here with Kanya D'Almeida.
I kind of stumbled into journalism actually. I didn't go looking for it.
How would you look at the system of education in Sri Lanka and compare it to something in, say, the States?
You know, if something is put in front of you, just ask yourself, what is this that I'm reading? Do I even agree with what's on the page?
The larger scheme of things, do you plan to keep writing more? I know that this came in an almost unexpected way from you. You gave birth to it almost.
I wrote it while I was nursing my son. I would have him on one side nursing, and I was like tapping out the story on my phone on the other hand in the dark.
What happens to journalists is a very real issue. This is not, it's not a made-up bogie story. Journalists are killed all over the world for the work they do.
I'm quite shocked, frankly, that more women don't act out, considering the amount of pressures and burdens that they have to bear and are expected to bear.
The proofing happens to fit the page, so it happens to fit the space, and it doesn't happen to fit the story. The story doesn't take precedence. What takes precedence is the space.
You go searching for the longer stories, not the sound bites, not the give me a quote in 20 minutes and I'll go and file the story.
Hello and welcome to the Debrief. We're here with Kanya D'Almeida. Kanya is a writer who has been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. She's also a journalist who has worked for many years at the IPS in the United States. But to know more about this story, where it's going and what her plans for herself in Sri Lanka and outside, let's speak now to Kanya. Hi Kanya.
Hi, thanks
nice
so
to
much
see you.
for having me.
Yes, you're welcome.
Great.
I'm very curious to ask you about a lot of the things that you've been doing. You've only returned to the country, I think it's been a little over a year?
Yeah, about 2 years.
2 years,
yeah.
Okay. So in the meantime, I know that you've been working on a podcast, you've been doing a lot of things besides the fact that you now have a family and you're growing your family. But before we go into all of this, the fact that you are now a shortlisted writer for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, I wanted to start at the beginning. As you know, I've known you from childhood. We've been to school together.
Yes, I'm aware.
Yes, I've been to school together. I want to know how this whole, when you were younger, did you always have like a desire to read, to know about the news? Were you always a voracious reader? Or how did that part come about, the foundation of all of this?
Yeah, I definitely always loved to read, but I was never really very interested in current affairs.
Okay.
So the fiction side of it was just a natural thing.
Yeah.
I was always with my face buried in a book. And as I got old, actually, my father used to really try to urge me to be more interested and involved and aware, you know, beyond like the Interact Club kind of top of surface level social issues that we tried to be involved in. But the reading and writing part of it, for sure, like almost from the time I was about 5 or 6 years old, I just had a pen and I just was in my own mind, my own imagination.
Right, that's interesting. I mean, I always looked at it as maybe you only read, but it's interesting to know that you also wrote. So you kept journals and diaries and that sort of thing, or was it short stories?
Oh my gosh, no, journals and diaries, which I really need to like burn at some point because it's full of such
incriminating
awful,
evidence.
and also just bad writing.
Yeah.
More than anything else,
I know.
That's what shames me.
I know.
But I have to say that I went to, after Bishops, I went to Asian International, and because English was always spoken in my home, so that was my language of thought and writing, and so switching over to the English medium really freed me up a lot to be able to write. And the principal of that school, Mrs. Kulbai Gunasekara, was extremely encouraging of creativity. So even when, you know, some of the other teachers would try to stifle that kind of creative thinking, she always insisted, no, you know, let them explore and really express themselves in a creative way.
Yeah, that's great, because I remember we went through the singular medium initially in school, or you were in the singular medium, I'm assuming, right, when we were at Bishops?
Yes, I was, yeah.
And then it's like when you go into a school like Asian International, it gives you that freedom to use your own language and also to express your creativity. Everybody knows that Gulbai was very well known for this sort of thing. She pushed people to be very creative. What about after your education? I know you studied and you have a double major actually in political science and English creative writing, right?
Writing, yeah.
So at this point, I'm assuming now you've grown into caring very much about politics and social aspects of our country and the world. How and why did you choose
So I didn't really choose it, to be honest with
Yeah.
you. My parents and my sister actually really pushed me to pursue my undergrad in the States,
Okay.
because they felt that the liberal arts system would really be very mind-opening, because we had been used to that kind of British curriculum where you study for exams and you memorize and you don't really think for yourself.
Correct.
So they urged me to apply to schools in the US, and I only got full financial aid at one school. And I didn't really want to go to this school because it sounded a little out there, and I was a very conventional person, like prefect, house captain. I was really into doing things properly.
Yeah.
And this school looked like it was just full of a lot of free-thinking hippies.
Yeah.
But they gave me a full ride.
Yeah.
So now can't
Yeah.
turn that down,
Correct.
right? My father couldn't afford to,
Yeah.
send me in any other way. So I went, and that school, Hampshire College, was the name of the college in Western Massachusetts. It's part of a consortium of other universities. It's an experimental school. So
Okay.
they actually broke away from the other more standard college systems, and they created this school where the students designed their own curriculum.
That's awesome.
It was just unbelievable. I mean, for one thing, it's extremely left-leaning. There's a Marxist economics department in one of the consortium schools. So I was suddenly just plunged into this whole world of politics, feminism, even being aware of myself as suddenly like a person of color. I had no
Correct,
idea
yeah.
about any of that. And just made a very, very strong community of like-minded friends who were activists, organizers, and it just completely changed my life actually in those 4 years, because I really was pushed from the professors and the students as well, I have to say, to think critically about anything.
Yeah.
If something is put in front of you, just ask yourself, what is this that I'm reading? Do I even agree with what's on the page? And that it's hard for me to explain how long it took me to embrace that.
Yeah.
Because some of my professors in my first year, they would actually call me to their office and explain to me that I was plagiarizing because I was so used to
Saying
writing and copying
Correct.
down what you're given.
Yeah.
And so it was terribly embarrassing that first year. But then when I kind of was able to learn those lessons, I just sort of took off, because I think, especially the way my sister and I were raised, both
Correct.
my parents, really encouraged that kind of critical thinking. But I'd never had the space,
Correct.
the kind of framework in which to really live that.
So when you look back at the Sri Lankan education system, which you spent a large part of your life in
Yeah.
or within, what do you think? I mean, I know you say critical thinking obviously is something that is lacking, but what else do you think? How would you look at the system of education in Sri Lanka and compare it to something in, say, the States? If you were just asked, like.
Sure, I think in the States, and I also have my own set of critiques of education in the United States, as you
Correct.
can probably
Yeah.
imagine. But yeah, for the sake of a liberal arts education, if I were just to take that framework, I think the fact that the professors, at least in my school, were also on a learning journey. They didn't feel that they were these, repositories of knowledge, and that we were just a blank canvas that they had to pour this information into. They were curious about us. They asked us questions. What did we think about the syllabus? What do you think about these readings? What do you make of, certain theory that we're
So it's very participatory.
very participatory and very sort of mutually respectful. I think as much as I loved my education, especially at Asian International, I don't know that any of our teachers ever really respected
Gave that,
us
yeah.
as independent minds, as free spirits.
Yeah.
It was always that we had to be curbed, and even the ones that really cared for us, it was about, we have to get you through this exam.
Correct.
So you may be interested in this subject, but I need to
First-
steer you back to
First getting through the
the
exam,
chapter.
yeah.
Yes. So yeah, I think that would be one of the biggest differences. It was very eye-opening in that regard, to
Correct.
be sitting with these professors who are now friends actually,
yeah.
and would come over for dinner, and
Yeah.
and very
have
special
have
to
that
have
kind
that.
of investment in you as a person, right?
and just respect you, and just
Yeah.
be curious about, well, what do you think? You
Yeah.
may be my student, but maybe there's something I can learn from you.
Correct. To get to the short story itself, before I get back into your career as a journalist, the Commonwealth, now you've given in your entry to the Commonwealth the Prize for Short Stories, and I read that it is one of over 6,000 entries that was selected. The last person from Sri Lanka to win a regional award was Michael Mendis, a young
That's
boy,
right.
yeah, who wrote Sarong Man for what was it? Let me see.
It's a very intriguing title.
Yeah, the sarong man in the old house and an incubus for a rainy night. It was a very interesting story, I remember.
2013, I believe.
Yeah, 2013. And I know that it's not it's a tough competition, because even if it was a regional award or the prize, the prize for the Commonwealth Prize itself, and there's also the regional awards.
Right.
Michael won the regional award, but whatever it is, it's challenging because each of these countries are bringing their very unique perspectives into it, and one story has to be compelling above everything else. Can you tell me about your story? Like, what have you written about?
Sure. I don't know how much of the story I can share until it's public, but to speak in kind of general terms. So there's 2 storylines happening simultaneously in the piece I submitted. It's essentially about a woman who has spent most of her life, 20 years, looking after somebody else's child.
Okay.
Sort of a cross between a domestic and a nanny. And for various reasons, actually cleaning this person's waste, doing everything for this person down to, putting them on the toilet every day. And the story starts with her, she's left that job, and you'll know why when you read the story.
Okay.
And she's come to this home for women, for destitute and impoverished women who have nowhere else to go at the end of their life. And her roommate is this very kind of brash old spinster who is coaxing her to tell her life story. So there's that backstory happening where you learn why she spent so many years looking after this child. And then there's also the unfolding relationship between this woman and her roommate,
Right.
which is taking an interesting trajectory that maybe you wouldn't expect between 2 old women at the end of their lives in an old folks home in Sri Lanka.
Oh, it's based here.
It is based in Sri Lanka. And one of the things that I really was sort of thinking about as I wrote the story, I wrote it while I was nursing my son. I would have him on one side nursing, and I was like tapping out the story on my phone on the other hand in the dark, because I was very much in a bad place actually when he was born. I can share that with you. I was going through quite a tough time adjusting to motherhood.
Yeah.
It was a huge shock to me. And as I was sitting and nursing my son every day, there was these 2 ladies who were I'd employed to help me in the house. They would cook, clean, look after me and all of us. And one of the things that one of them did was she would wash the soiled nappies.
Yeah.
And one day I was sitting and just watching her, and the thought just popped into my head, who is this child's mother? You or the woman who's washing the nappies? Like it just occurred to me. And I felt like such an imposter, and I started to think about, well, what is motherhood? Is it just biologically giving birth to a child, or is it all the work that goes into actually looking after another human being? And do I get to call myself that? That was one of the thoughts that was going through my mind, and so the story kind of was born out of that.
Wow.
And I wrote it really I didn't have a lot of time. I was nursing the whole day and night, and so whenever I had a moment I just jotted a sentence down. And even yesterday I opened up a notebook and I found a few odd sentences written from that story. So when I finally sat down to type it out on the computer, it was all just
fell in
there.
place.
And I've never written a story like that. I've always thought, my God, no, I have to be inspired. I have to sit at my desk. I have to,
the pressure.
do this.
Correct.
And this just kind of, in just little bits and pieces, it just came to me.
Yeah, that's great. I can't wait to read it first
Thank
thing.
you. Yeah.
How long do we have to wait?
July is when they announce the winner. Sorry.
No, that's not bad. That's not so bad. But I also want to know, like, in the larger scheme of things, do you plan to keep writing more? I know that this came in an almost unexpected way from you. You gave birth to it almost.
Right.
But writing, I mean, there are several other awards. Any aspiring writer in Sri Lanka would want to get the Gratian. There's also the DSC Award for South Asian Literature. This is what anyone would want. I know there's some big challenges, and just the fact that you write it and you submit an entry does not mean that it's going to meet the criteria. It has nothing to do with your quality of writing, but a lot to do with the competition at that time, right? What other people will submit. So is that something that you think you're going to put that pressure on yourself right now, in the long run even? Is that where you see yourself going?
I think first and foremost, now that I've had this recognition, which, I mean, I hate to say it, but sometimes getting that external recognition does give you the fuel you need.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're just sitting in this room, you're writing. I mean, my primary audience are my parents, my sister and my husband. And as much as I'm so grateful to them for their encouragement, and they love everything I give them and their support, it's really helpful to have, a completely unknown panel of judges be like, we saw something here. So I think before thinking about another prize or even trying not to think about okay, the regional
This
winner,
one,
the
yeah.
overall winner, is to just finish this book of short stories that I've been working on for quite some time.
Right.
And the book, actually, all of the stories in some way or another, explores sort of women and madness. And I think it's because this phrase got stuck in my head. One of my friend's husbands used to always, just call us mad bloody women.
Yeah.
Just throw that
Yeah.
out there. And it just got me thinking, who are these mad women that we could
And
be
what is
perceived
mad?
as?
Yeah.
What is mad? And also to explore women's relationships to each other. I don't know if you're familiar with that old test called the Bechdel test. It's a test that kind of measures women's representation in fiction.
Nice.
And there's 3 criteria. So it's, are there more than one female characters? Do those women talk to each other? And if they do they talk about anything other than a man?
Correct.
And when I held up even my own fiction to that standard, it was falling short. So I started to get really interested in, how do women relate to each other without the figure of the father, the husband, the lover, the boss,
Yeah.
because men do occupy such a
Correct.
dominant space in our lives. And, and even as far as storytelling goes, how many women are really asked to tell their story or are told you have a story worth telling?
Yeah.
And even in my family, a lot of the time my father is called upon to share his stories, and he's got a lot of brilliant stories,
Yes.
as you know. But no one ever calls my mother up to ask her, and she has a great
Correct.
repertoire
Yeah.
of stories. And so how many women's stories will just go to the grave with them? And I love to imagine those. I like to draw from those actual stories, but also just imagine these cantankerous old women,
Correct.
and what might they think and do given the
Correct.
chance to get together and
Correct.
without the influence
Yeah.
of men.
And we have also experienced some of these women in our family
Extended
circles,
family,
extended
exactly.
family circles,
Yes.
and what they do. And
Yes.
I love that. I love that women, even in Sri Lanka, with the sort of cultural boundaries and whatever, that women still in Sri Lanka can be very in their own spaces where they feel safe.
Correct.
Can be very even incorrect, if you look at it that way, right?
Right.
Like I like that they can come out and say what they want
That's
to say.
true.
And be,
You're right, actually. Sri Lanka does, I guess, we do have some space to be that way.
we can be we can be incorrect, but within our safe spaces. It doesn't happen out there, but it does happen in the conversations that we hear our mothers tell us, so our aunts
Right.
and moms when they get together.
Exactly.
But I wanted to ask you more about this. The book. I mean, you just explained about the book you were writing on, or the collection of short stories on mad women. I'm very interested in the word mad because what mad means, I have always felt that mad does not necessarily mean mad. It's just a different reality.
Yep.
So is that what you're exploring when you're talking about mad women, or is it insanity? And
Yeah, it's more what you said. It's circumstance and what maybe pushes women to act in certain. First of all, I'm quite shocked, frankly, that more women don't act out, considering the amount of pressures and burdens that they have to bear and are expected to bear, with a smiling
Correct.
face rather than break down or snap or really just go, postal on everybody,
Correct.
because
Yeah.
they have to be kind of holding the fort down.
all the time.
And so I'm very interested in how, what are these circumstances that lead women into situations where, in my stories, I like to imagine that they act out more.
Yeah.
So what if a woman is being abused and pushed to the wall? Will she actually murder the abuser? Will she, really stick it to the man in ways that we're not allowed to do in polite? That's the fun thing about
Yeah.
fiction, is I
Yeah,
can
you can
imagine
take
that
it.
other ending.
Yeah.
And I just get such a kick out of just
Yeah.
imagining all these old women. And it's always old women. They're always getting together in little
Yeah.
groups of 2 or 3 and taking over the world. So it's more that kind of madness
Yeah.
of circumstance and
Correct.
of very ordinary kind of nondescript situations that I think are quite remarkable, actually, that most women have to live through on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of the story that you wrote for the Commonwealth Short Story and also this collection, I see that, right now a recurring theme that I see is women and their burdens and how they react or act, and motherhood. But looking at some of the work that you've done in your career as a journalist, I'd say that you have a heart for people. It's more about how you want to represent people, how you want to get very deep into how people are feeling, thinking, and that goes along with how you feel and think as a person.
Right.
How do you, even in journalism, is that something that has always driven you? Is that something that has people been are people the focus?
yeah, well, I suppose I search for that, but it wouldn't be very accurate to say that the bulk of my journalism career has been that, because I kind of stumbled into journalism actually. I didn't go looking for it. And I can kind of give you that aside if you're interested, because like a lot of people have been asking me this now that the story has been shortlisted. It's like, oh, well, what was your career? And actually, because after I graduated my undergrad, I moved to New York, very naively thinking, go to the Big Apple and see what happens. But of course, not having a proper working visa and everything, the opportunities are very limited. So I was actually cleaning a lady's house for a living. She very kindly took in this random Sri Lankan to clean her house. And one day in the lift, this was in a part of the town where a lot of very wealthy older people lived. So there were not many brown skinned people in that building. Got into the lift one day and there were two other people who looked suspiciously like Sri Lankans.
Okay.
And they said, dear, are you a Sri Lankan? And it turned out to be Eranga and Priyanga, the famous Sri Lankan musical duo.
Okay.
They're husband and wife duo. I had not heard of them. I think maybe it's a different generation to us. My parents subsequently told me, and they said, my gosh, this is unacceptable. You can't be cleaning people's houses. We'll connect you with a gentleman that we know at the United Nations. Wow. Didn't say anything more, just gave me the contact. But I got the contact mixed up because at the same time I was looking for a store in Staten Island, a grocery store, to let me host a table. I was volunteering at a housing organization. We wanted to give some housing information to Sri Lankans about what their options were as renters. I wrote to this UN contact saying, excuse me, sir, do you have a, this grocery store in Staten Island where I can come and set up a table? Get an email back saying, I'm very sorry, I'm a journalist based at the UN. I look at his signature and it's Talif Dean, the regional bureau of the Interpress Service News Agency, which was of course the agency that our uncle Richard was working for right before he was killed. So that was my first job in journalism, was Talif Dean forgiving my mistake that I thought he was a grocery store owner, calling me in to do this internship. So that kind of fell into my lap. And the initial reporting involved in that job was very straightforward. It was very kind of just political reporting at the UN. But then as I was given more space within the agency, I really don't like that term, human interest stories, but I guess to answer your question, it is that, right? You go searching for the longer stories, not the sound bites, not the give me a quote in 20 minutes and I'll go and file the story. And, just to kind of answer maybe a different question as well, I think it's what's lacking in a lot of journalism is this element of storytelling. And how many of us are able to sit down with our sources and be like, what was your childhood like? And doesn't that open up a much bigger story than the one that we thought we had before us? So I was able to then, do a little bit more of that journalism later on.
Yeah, so something I feel, and we were discussing earlier, is that this news cycle and how the news cycle dominates more than even the real issues. And we were talking about how in journalism, journalists don't get to spend time with their sources, they don't get to get the backstory, they don't get to actually plan out stories and do something that actually makes an impact. And a lot of, I know IPS works with the Global South, and a lot of the issues that the Global South faces. And even when you look at journalism as an industry in Sri Lanka, and I'm thinking your story and my story are quite similar in some ways, in that I never planned to get into journalism. I just ended up there. It was quite by chance. Also the fact that Richard was our uncle, and that was a defining moment for me. And to segue into that, was that in any way something that affected you growing up? The fact that Richard D'Souza was our uncle?
I mean, our parents didn't really tell us. Did you know that? For the longest time, we didn't know anything about how Richard had died. And when you're that young, you don't really question, but then you sort of see this person is present in their absence, the pictures, and of course his mom, Manurani, she lived with my grandmother at a time. But then as I got to learn more about what he did, I mean, of course, and working at IPS that was a big shift. Because when I went as a young journalist, like a cub reporter, I guess you could say, into IPS, and they had his plaque on the wall. So suddenly I thought, my God, there's a legacy here. And I was not even aware that I was living in this legacy. So maybe I need to step into that a little bit at least, own that, you know. Not in any grandiose way, but just because, it matters who your ancestors are, right? And what they did or what they tried to do.
And did you find any opposition from your parents in any way? Because for me personally, my mom had a lot of issues about me getting into journalism, especially in Sri Lanka, because of what happened to Richard and what happened to many journalists. Yeah, fear.
Okay.
What happened to many journalists afterwards. And for you, did you feel at any point, maybe because you were abroad, were you less afraid? Because what happens to journalists is a very real issue. This is not, it's not a made up bogie story. Yeah. Journalists are killed all over the world for the work they do. So at any point, did you feel that if you had followed Richard's footsteps, that especially in Sri Lanka, that it would have been trouble?
I mean, I think I'm just lucky that I had my entire journalism career outside of this country. Because to be honest with you, I didn't have to reckon with that reality. And in the US, there are many, many ways that people are censored, in the US. But that kind of attack on journalists doesn't exist there, as
Correct. You're not murdered for...
You have a lot more space. And you might, if you touch like really hot button issues, find yourself in the crosshairs of their whole sticky legal system. But I think what a privilege, right? I got to have that career without having to really reckon with that. And there was one story, one of the last long form pieces I did for the place I worked for, Rewire. It was actually an outlet that published stories on women's reproductive rights. So very sort of niche. And one of the stories that I wanted to pursue was the mothers of the people that had been caught up in the post 9/11 legal system.
Right.
So had been arrested on terrorism charges and locked up for their whole lives, actually, Muslim immigrants in the US who had absolutely no involvement in any kind of terrorist activity. They were arrested based on their lifestyle. So there was a threat that they might become radicalized.
Right.
And there was a whole movement happening in New York City, close to where I lived, that I became involved in, of their family members. The mothers were trying to win justice for these people. So I was trying to, convince my editors, like, look, this is a reproductive justice story because it's about families being torn apart. And they allowed me to do this long 3-part series, and doing that story, I think for the first time felt that fear, that kind of, oh gosh, when you're researching something, is someone looking over me, the big brother feeling? Because it was these people that had been, when you say 9/11 or even that word in the US, it's frightening, and you're passing in and out of airports, you do wonder. And I was in correspondence with some of these men. They're considered sort of like most wanted, in the system. So I did feel it a little bit then, and I have to say, to my parents' credit, they were just so encouraging. And for that I have to say, particularly my father. He does kind of, he wouldn't say this in a careless way, but he encourages us to be fearless. He doesn't believe in making decisions based on fear. Even in an interview, I might say, I don't really want to touch that. And he would never step back from saying what he really feels, if it's the truth.
Right. So since we've been discussing media, especially, even though we started with your prize or potential prize and your entry into the Commonwealth Short Story competition, we've ended up discussing media and journalism because that's primarily who you are, I think, as in terms of identity, and it it speaks so much to me as a journalist because I feel that we've had a similar journey. And I just want to ask you, if you look at the journalism industry or the media industry in Sri Lanka, particularly coming from outside, because you worked in New York for so long, you worked at the IPS, what would you think ails the Sri Lankan media industry, looking at it from an outside point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a very basic level, I think we lack kind of quality control. I think if we were to hold ourselves to a higher standard with everything from, even you take something like proofreading, fact checking, copy editing. When the last outfit I worked for, this Rewire News, any story I wrote, even if it was a 800 word, just a short little breaking piece on something that was happening in the US, it went through multiple editors. And there was just a lot of care given to every word that was on the page, and maybe just a respect for the written word and taking seriously everything that we put out. And I don't see that really a lot here, that kind of attention to detail, or maybe just going the extra mile with making sure that everything we put out is of a certain standard. I don't know if it's unfair to kind of give that blanket.
No, that's interesting, because that's like a perspective from outside the industry. From within the industry, and this is something we've discussed a lot in on panels and stuff like that, how our media industry is geared very much towards breaking news, getting the news out as fast as possible. There's little verification. It's a competitive industry, and each person is looking to be the first person that a consumer goes to for the news. Now, whether that news is verified, whether it's factual, whether it has enough details is irrelevant, because if you look at a lot of the news websites out there, and primarily we're talking about websites, it may be a paragraph at the most. At the most.
Right.
Some news alerts and stories are a sentence. So if you go and click on the website, you will find a sentence. But there's no context. There's nothing that tells you anything. For instance, something as simple as a few days ago, I got a breaking news update saying that there was traffic on the Kandy-Colombo road. Now, I want to know why there is traffic. Don't just tell me there is traffic. That gives me one point of view. But what's going on? Like, why is this an incident? Why are we reporting it, right? So little things like that. Even there's very little context given. And I myself am in the media industry, and of course at ROE we try to do things very differently.
Yeah.
But and there are competing interests and things like the finances, how you keep a media organization running, advertising. So when it comes to even sub-editing or proofing, like I explained to you, in journalism, in my experience in journalism in Sri Lanka, a lot of the time the proofing happens to fit the page. So it happens to fit the space, and it doesn't happen to fit the story. The story doesn't take precedence.
Right.
What takes precedence is the space. It's the same with advertising space. So if an advertisement comes in, a story will get cut off, because what's more important is the advertising.
Right.
So because of these priorities, so the change. I won't say that funding is not necessary. Funding and advertising is important, but maybe because there is no balance, or because the priorities have shifted so much to advertising, that a lot of the time the stories that come out are supposed to come out don't come out the way they are supposed to. And like you said a lot before, also there's very little vetting, there's very little fact checking, there's very little. So then what happens? There are more entities that come up saying that they're going to fact check. There are more and more groups, more and more WhatsApp groups claiming to fact check, claiming to be fact checkers. But a lot of the time you don't even know if this information is true. Right. And we're still talking about the English media circle. But when you look at the singular or vernacular languages, it has a much deeper impact, a much larger impact, and an impact that none of us really have very much of an idea about, because we still primarily work in the English circles. Yeah. So I'm not saying that it's a blanket statement, certainly not, but when you look at it from an outside point of view, the fact that you can see this is very important, because that is the reality.
Yeah.
And how much we can work to change it is important, and I'd love to know if you have any ideas about what you can do as a journalist back in Sri Lanka. Do you have any ideas about?
Well, I mean, there's a whole sort of movement, I think, even globally, to slow down the news. It's slow journalism,
correct,
right? You've heard of it. And it takes so many forms, and I think can we just embody that a little bit, at least? So one of the projects that I've been working on since I came back, just completely on sort of as a personal thing, is this podcast.
Yes.
It's called The Darkest Light, and it's getting women's stories of motherhood, ordinary women. They don't have to have some media empire, for me to be interested in that story. Because I feel like, you said it yourself. Why do we need to know that there's traffic on the road?
Yeah.
What about that whole other story?
Correct, exactly.
Who built the road,
Yes.
or what's happening on the other end of the traffic jam? And so when we actually talk about true storytelling, it is that. It is context, it is background, it is fact.
Correct.
And in this project that I'm doing, so many of the women, when I approach them and I say, I want to get your story, they say, but is my story really interesting to you? Is it worth telling? And what I've been tracking, just getting a dozen or so women's stories is a huge issue across the entire birth space in Sri Lanka. Issues in hospitals, issues to do with postpartum health, issues to do with women being so utterly lonely that they are sometimes at a breaking point. And this actually gives you a very clear picture of where we're at as a society. And I don't need to go after a kind of hard-hitting political angle. This is a very, very quiet story that's actually generations old, but it's telling me so much about contemporary Sri Lanka. That needs to change.
Yeah, and it tells you so much about where the attention of the media has been all this time, because like I just said, the circus is on breaking news. No one is knowing the deeper stories, nobody's looking at the data, nobody's really digging. And something that I've been talking about a lot of the time is people think investigative journalism is again geared towards unmasking a politician, or some kind of sting, an expose, some kind of accountability issue. And it doesn't have to be that. There can be investigation in health, there can be in maternal health, whether it's reproductive health, whether it's I always encourage a lot of the journalists I speak to look at environment, look at all of these things in terms of that investigative lens, because when you do that research, then like you said, there's a trend that emerges, and the stories ought to be there. How you ultimately package it and sell it, or when I say sell, I'm not talking in terms of money, but how you sell it on your platform or sell it to people is the second phase. But you don't see that happening in journalism in Sri Lanka, and perhaps globally even this is something that happens, and that's something that I would like to personally see change. And your podcast, I know about your podcast, and you'll be working with us also hopefully in the future with your series on motherhood. So these are all good things, and I'd really like to see a change in the industry as a whole in Sri Lanka with people like you and other people who think deeply about the deep issues.
And I would say, Roel, to answer like an earlier question you asked about the school system, I think it's almost become trendy now to talk about how the education system needs to change. Everybody's on that bandwagon now.
And everybody thinks that is the thing that needs to change.
So, but also no clarity on exactly what needs to change. But I would say just, trying my best to parent a 21-month-old child, I think the change needs to come so much earlier, because by the time we're sending them off to school, a lot of damage has already been done. Because if we're not respecting children from that young age, everything that I said that teachers would do in a school system, I think we as parents, again, I don't want to speak for everyone, I'll just speak for myself. I tend to do that to my own child. I tend to think, here's a little person that's behaving badly, needs to be brought to heel. I'm going to tell him stuff, and he's going to listen. And so if we're doing that at 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, then by the time they're 7, that's already inculcated into them. They're like, okay, I guess I just need to toe the line now. So we are having a crisis. We're talking earlier about governance. Okay, let's not even get into the constitution, let's not get into any of that, but what about governance as like raising people who feel the need to take some responsibility as citizens of this country? Because I'm getting a little bit sick of people kind of moping around saying nothing is going to change, because it's so rotten. Everything's rotten. The politicians are rotten.
Pointing fingers at the government all the time.
But who is going to take that initiative? You and I were talking about the length of our working day. Doing everything from start to finish. Do we take that responsibility upon ourselves, at the end of the day? And how can we be taught to do that? I was lucky. I had this, very international education, as I said. And you have come to, your career maybe from
chance, destiny.
But taking that responsibility of quality and hard work.
And so that sense of civic duty, it's something I talk about all the time. People really don't have that sense of, it's more about what we can take and what is owed to us, but there's very little about what do we give back to our nation, or what do we give back as a legacy, what do we give back to our children, what do we give back to our parents, the people around us. It doesn't have to be huge sweeping changes. It's more about what do you do within your circle of influence. And as we know, media itself is considered one of the mountains of influence. So media governance, all of these things. So people in places of influence should not be thinking in terms of accumulation of whatever it is, whether it's wealth or prestige or whatever. It's more about what you give back, because we are a citizenry living together in one country or one geographical space. So interesting and very compelling conversation with you. Probably one of the most I've enjoyed in a while.
Thank you.
I really hope hope for good news when it comes to the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. But whether you get good news or not, I'm sure you know this as well as I do, that that's not what you were after. You have been able to birth a really good piece. You've been able to send it to an international competition. It's not a mark of who you are. Who you are is the larger picture of who you are as a writer and your experiences and what you're trying to do. So thank you for coming onto the show with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I hope you enjoyed yourself.
I did. I had a great time.
Awesome.
Thank you.